Welcome to Analyst Talk with Jason Elder. It's like coffee with an analyst, or it could be whiskey with an analyst reading a spreadsheet, linking crime events, identifying a series, and getting the latest scoop on association news and training. So please don't be that analyst and join us as we define the law enforcement analysis profession one episode at a time.
How we doing, analysts? This is Jason Elder, and we have a new show for you called Before You Leap, a exploration into critical thinking and biases. And I am joined here with my good friend, Randy Stickley. Randy, how we doing?
I am doing fantastic, Jason. How about yourself?
I am doing very well. So for those that might not know Randy, I did have him on the show. He presents at conferences. He talks a lot about this idea on intelligence analysis and critical thinking. And he's just an all-around good guy. So I thought he was the perfect person to get tasked this to just go through and give us 15 minutes each time. We'll probably do these on a monthly basis to give you, the listeners, an idea on little tips and tricks and ideas on critical thinking and talk about the different biases that we all can have. Randy, do you want to add to any of that before we get started?
Not really. You hit it all on the head. And if I can steal the mic for a quick second, one of the things, and that's why I'm so passionate about talking intelligence analysis, it's been my line of work my entire professional career. But one of the things that I've latched onto is, like you said, at conferences and other discussion points, LinkedIn posts, it's been about the idea of utilizing thought. Now, when we think about intelligence analysis, we typically think about things from two spectrums. You have creative thought, you have critical thought. More often than not, people see these as those bedrock concepts of intelligence analysis. You need to have that imaginative thinking side to get all those possibilities out there, start making us think outside the box. But ultimately, it all comes back to that critical side of things, the side of our thinking and our process cognitively that makes us look at things from a more scientific method, if you will, a little bit more applied science, so that makes us start systematically looking at things through a more objective lens and makes us challenge those points of objectivity that we all have as intelligence professionals.
Nice. All right. So let's just start with this week's lesson. What do you got for us?
So I hit on the word objectivity, and objectivity is paramount in intelligence work overall. We as human beings, it's in the Latin name of our kind of genus and our species, if you will, the idea of the phrase Homo sapien. I know folks across academia and the scientific community, biologically speaking, have different names for humans. Homo sapien has different definitions. If you're a Latin aficionado, some people translate it as wise man, some people translate it as clever man. But more importantly, it comes down to the concept and the translation of thinking man. We, evolutionarily speaking, utilize objective thought to get rid of any predisposed or possibly haphazard scenarios that may lend us into some trouble. More often than not, when we think about going through these scenarios, we have those cognitive processes, again, just going outside the realm of intelligence, that creative and critical side. We start trying to think, how are we going to plan our day? How are we going to do things that sustain our own existence? More often than not, those are very basic things. Get up, brush your teeth, get dressed, basic motor things that we have in our day to day. But once we start getting into those more complex scenarios, those more taxing, sorry about that, scenarios that we go through, i.e. more complex social situations, or in terms of intelligence work, more complex thought processes to answer the so what of whatever our task is. That's when we start getting into these cognitive shortcuts, these traps, if you will. So more often than not, that objectivity, at no fault of our own, and sometimes at fault of our own, if you're somebody who lets your objectivity go out the window, that's when the B word in intelligence comes in. And I love saying that with air quotes around it, the B word, because that word is bias. And we all have it, Jason. I mean, every one of us do. Comes down to things that we eat, things that we like to listen to, sports teams, any preferences. Now, we often hear that term bias when we're talking about the media. We hear that when we talk about a lot of the big P politics things that are happening in the world today. However, if we think about it from an intelligence professional centric kind of lens, these are things that we do as human beings cognitively that help us prioritize or even make simpler complex scenarios. And it's, again, no fault of our own more often than not. Implicit or inherent biases happen all the time.
Mhm.
And quite honestly, it's a very slippery slope and a minefield that we as intelligence professionals and as human beings in general have to be cognizant of, because that window of objectivity is something that we have to keep in mind when we're going through our intelligence briefs, our packets, or whatever you may call your product you're working on. You can't let those shortcuts or those traps, if you will, undercut any of the great objectives so what that you're trying to lend out to your client, your customer, or your stakeholder.
Hmm. I would think that when it comes to critical thinking and creative thinking, especially in the law enforcement analysis profession,
Mhm.
analysts rely more on those two aspects the less data that they have, or maybe the more questions they have. If I'm thinking as an analyst, I don't normally have the entire picture in front of me. I might not have all the pieces to the puzzle, if you will.
Mhm.
And so as I'm trying to understand what's important and to identify some actionable solutions, the more those gaps that I have, the more I have to process in terms of creative and critical thinking. And then that leads to more bias. Do you feel that's the case, or how do you feel about that concept?
Absolutely. We'll talk about this in later segments, but there's a whole spectrum of biases that we have, that we possess as human beings, that stem from a number of different things. Circumstances such as too much data. You may lose the forest for the trees, and you may be staring at an infinite sea of data in front of you, and you may start kind of losing what the objectivity is just based on how much information you're mired in. You
Mm-hmm.
could also have that from not enough data, or maybe what you're getting to here is not enough meaning. We may
Mm-hmm.
have seemingly disparate pieces of data that are sitting in front of us, and it leaves a pretty wide aperture, a pretty wide berth for us to start supplanting our own ideas in there. One of the worst things that we can do as thinking humans, intelligence professionals, anyone who utilizes analytical thought in their profession, is to take that concept of what if and to supplant it into your what is. What we have is not enough information, not enough meaning. We can't let what if get in the way. There's that old adage, ifs and buts were candies and nuts, and every day would be Christmas. That we don't have that luxury in intelligence. It's a little more, has a little more gravitas to it, if you will. But something else to consider when we're doing that is and it dovetails nicely off your point there, that same spectrum I was talking about, the need to act quickly or in a timely manner. That timeliness aspect that you hit on is an absolute kind of deadline for us if in this profession. When we get into multiple amounts of data or not enough data, we don't have time to sit and pontificate about what could we do more. We have to come up with something very tactful, very quick, that will actually get us to that point a little more topically, cogently, and even timely. So from there, you do have to utilize your critical thinking to ascertain what are the best avenues that I could get to that will allow me to arrive at this data point, but also not take away from the timeliness of my intelligence. But then that final point here, I would also say when we're going through all of this, it's the need to remember what we can, or more importantly, what should we remember? This is where some of those implicit inherent biases can come into play, because we tend to gravitate more toward the things that we are either comfortable with or things that we have pre-existing knowledge on. I'm a
Mm.
huge movie guy, I'm a huge history guy, so and it drives my wife insane sometimes, but I can watch a movie or a documentary one time and darn near remember the whole thing. But if it comes down to important stuff like, hey, you forgot to file this one thing on your taxes, oh boy. So it's stuff that I tend to like, that I tend to want to remember, and things that I gravitate toward that I remember more closely. And that's something that a lot of us fall into in this profession. So that's something that we have to keep in mind as we go through and have further discussions on these biases.
Yeah, and that fits nicely into my next point. I know when I was a law enforcement analyst, I had some bad habits, and I knew I didn't know the full story like we've talked about before, and I was comfortable with the data. So I stayed with the data, right? So you're asking me to do a rundown or do an intelligence report or get you some trending data. I'm comfortable in that space in terms of data. And I can give you some reports, but I stop short a lot of times of that extra thinking that I think you're getting to, and where you're getting into solutions, recommendations once you hand over that report or that data that's being asked for. Because to me, it's concrete what the data is, right? I'm not sticking my neck out per se, because the data is the data, right? If I get into like what's important or making assumptions or getting into that conclusions, then that opens me up a little bit, and I definitely was not comfortable a lot of times in that setting.
What you just said there makes me think of a phrase one of my first bosses told me in the intelligence profession, and that was the phrase, get comfortable with being uncomfortable. We're not always going to have portfolios and tasks and areas of responsibility that are going to line up exactly with what we're comfortable with. Just to give a brief overview of that, when in my first shop, I remember going through the interview, and we had two teams, one that covered international affairs, one that covered domestic affairs. And I was, of course, steadfast into the international. At the time of my ascension into my first intelligence role, Syria was a really hot topic area with the Assad regime and the Obama administration drawing the quote unquote red line in the sand over the use of chemical weapons. And of course, I wanted to cover that as my portfolio. And I mentioned that. Day one of the job comes in, all the new hires were sitting down, and my boss looked at me and went, and congratulations, you're now the North Africa analyst. I knew nothing apart from the situation in Libya and some light political turmoil in Egypt. But from there, I got uncomfortable, and I got comfortable with being uncomfortable. And to this day, it's still one of my pet projects. So we can't really latch ourselves to certain topics just because we're comfortable with it. We have to be able to break out of our own area. And that's something that we as analysts, my wife does it, I do it. I'm pretty sure every one of us that's in this law enforcement field does this. We overthink, and that's perfectly fine. Sometimes we can feel like we're spinning the drain and circling the same point over and over, but it's that circling the drain that we really start to get to those more substantive, objective points. And it's through that we have to be uncomfortable. I know that sounds really pessimistic, and it sounds a little bit sadist, but trust me, it works out for us in the long run.
Yeah. And I remember talking about this on your episode when I had you on the podcast. Is I think it's almost easier if you are tasked with something that is very easily defined. In your case, it was North Africa. Like okay, go. And then the house that you're going to live in, so to speak, right?
Yeah.
And whereas law enforcement analysts out there, they're the jack of all trades. They're the go-to for every little thing that can be associated with data. So it can be difficult to be tasked in such a way where you can focus and be that subject matter expert and to use these critical skills that we're going to talk about.
Absolutely. And that's why I have such a passion for this, because regardless if you're covering gang activity in a metropolitan area, drug trafficking at the border, terrorism threatening the homeland, or even financial crimes from a corporate entity, at the end of the day, you have to lean back on your critical thinking, and that critical thinking lends itself to such a huge spectrum. Biases is one of those big points, and I'm really excited to cover further topics in biases and other layers throughout a series of these conversations, Jason.
All right. So just wrapping up this episode, then, what is your advice to those that are listening to this, that I will call this, since that's the title of the show, what are you telling them? Before you leap, do this.
Before you leap, think, and then think again. I mean, that's the way it is. That's the way it is in this profession. You have to always be thinking on your toes. You have to think about what decision point you're moving toward. And if I can take the last couple seconds to do a shameless plug, it's that type of thinking and that type of tenacity and passion that I think this will be the first kind of larger forum that I will announce. I got the blessing from my co-author, so she's not going to shoot me in the process while saying this. But there's a colleague of mine from Ohio. Her name's Akshata Kumavat. She and I presented at several conferences together, had a lot of great working relationships. We are actually in the pre-publication phase of our book. that is covering this topic exclusively. It is called Rethinking Thought. Looking forward to getting those completed portions done, getting it reviewed, and hopefully hitting the shelves within the coming months. So yeah,
Very
that's
good.
exciting.
Yes, yes, and excellent. And I've had you both on the show, so that's very good. So yeah, and I would highly recommend if you're at a conference where either one of those two are speaking, take advantage of that presentation. So all right, so well, let's just kind of finish up since this is the first of many in terms of these before you leap sessions here. Let's end with just giving the audience a little preview of what the next couple episodes are going to look like.
Yeah. So I mentioned that spectrum of biases. I want to hit on a codex that was created to help articulate what exactly those biases are. But also, while doing that, hitting on what I view are the most pertinent biases. Now, when I say the most pertinent ones, these are the ones that are in our faces constantly and they're not really going anywhere. And there's a lot of great practical applications. I know people say bias or say some of these techniques, and newer analysts look at the forest and go, what in the world are they talking about? But I promise you, these are things for these newer folks, or even some of the folks that are more seasoned in the listener base, they may not necessarily think of, but it's important to bring that back to the forefront and make it more practical and approachable. That way they understand exactly what's in front of them and they understand what's the best way to defeat that and get back on that objective path in their intelligence work.
Nice. Nice. All right. So with each episode, we will be putting in links in the show notes for additional information on what we discuss. And I guess, Randy, if somebody has a question in between episodes, how should they contact you?
They can hit me up on LinkedIn. I'm on there quite religiously and quite actively. But they could also, if they feel so inclined, they can hit me up on my email if they want to. And I'm sure you'll probably link it in the show notes. But that is Randall, Randall .c.stickley, Stickley, and then after that Y, 2 lowercase i's at gmail.com.
Nice. And you can always reach me at leapodcasts@gmail.com. Randy, I'm really looking forward to this adventure. Thank you so much for your time, and you be safe.
No, thank you very much, Jason. Looking forward to it, sir.
Thank you for making it to the end of another episode of Analyst Talk with Jason Elder. You can show your support by sharing this and other episodes found on our website at www.leapodcasts.com. If you have a topic you would like us to cover or have a suggestion for our next guest, please send us an email at leapodcasts@gmail.com. Till next time, analysts, keep talking.